Income Tax 2020 Dependents Questionnaire. Come in, relax with Income Tax 2020. Here we are on the 1040 instructions, which will have the questionnaire that we'll be going through. Now, we're in the 2019 instructions at this time. 2020 instructions are not out yet, but we want to be showing it in the 2019 instructions so you can see where that questionnaire is at. It should be much the same for 2020. And then, of course, in 2020 filing season, if you want to use this tool, you can find it there on the IRS website for instructions on the 1040. So we're going to be scrolling down, table of contents here. We're looking then at the dependents. So I'm going to go to the dependents. I can jump to the dependents with this page number 16 jumping tool right here. We've got the intro on the left-hand side, our questionnaire on the right-hand side. I'm going to zoom in on this, so I'll make it as large as I can just to focus in on the questionnaire. So here we have the step-by-step process. It'll basically be going through the steps of first, do we qualify as a qualifying child? If they do, then you're kind of gearing that towards the child tax credit. If not, then you're kind of thinking about the other credit for the other dependent credit. And so that means that you're going to be thinking of the questionnaire one on top of the other. Do they qualify for a qualifying child? If not, then you go down to the next qualification, which would be the next default status for tax purposes in terms of the most benefit that you would have. So here we go. Do you have a qualifying child? We'll read through this fairly quickly. And again, if you have this as a problem or a question on your tax return, or if someone qualifies for a qualifying child, you can go in through this questionnaire and find the place that's causing you the problems or the questions. And it might refer then to a publication where you can go into further research about it. Also note that you can use tax software. Lacert tax software, for example, often will provide guidance and whatnot in terms of whether something is entered properly, or it can give you some kind of idea about whether someone would qualify or not, and then you can go from there once again. So do you have a qualifying child? A qualifying child is a child who is son, daughter, stepchild, foster child, brother, sister, stepbrother, stepsister, half-brother, half-sister, or descendant of any of them. For example, your grandchild, niece, or nephew. Now, when you enter this into the dependents into Lacert, they will typically give you kind of some of those options, which of course will give you an idea. So when you're working with tax software, once again, you're going to have, some rough idea, because if you go down to the data inputs screen for the dependents, which is here, then you'll have the relationship, and you'll have all these relationships. So you can go through there and you would say, okay, so you would think that would line up fairly close to the relationship test, should give you at least a preliminary idea that you can drill down to on further. Then and. Notice the and is going to be important here, and rather than or, so they have to meet both of these tests here. Was, and now we're on the age test. Now, in 2019, remember, if you're doing 2020 return, when you look at the instructions in 2020, you'll be looking at 2020. So you got to kind of replace 2019 for 2020, as will be the case when the instructions are out for the 2020, if that is what you're looking into. So under the age of 19 at the end of 2019, and younger than you or your spouse filing jointly. So again, if it's 2020, you would imagine this rule would be the same there, 2020 under the age of 19. So that's your age test that you're thinking of is 19. And then or under the age of 24 at the end of 2019. Again, if it was a 2020 return, you would imagine that would be at 2020. And a student and younger than you or your spouse if filing jointly. So the general rule is 19 or if student, 24 for the age of the child to possibly be a qualifying child. Then or any age or permanently and totally disabled. So if that's going to be the case, then you might be able to find more detail on that just to define what that term means. And so next test, who didn't provide over half his or her own support for 2019. Again, if it was 2020, you'd be thinking 2020 for the 2020 instructions. To see more information about that, you can take a look at the publication 501. So if that's a question component, question part, take a look at publication 501. You can look up on the IRS website. And who isn't filing a joint return for 2019, which again, you would say 2020 if you were thinking about the 2020 filing season and looking at this in the 2020 instructions, meaning they can't be married filing joint and then claimed on someone else's tax return unless it's an unusual situation, which is, or is filing a joint return for 2019 only to claim a refund or withhold income tax or estimated tax paid. So if that's the situation, you might want to see publication 501 for details on that. Lastly, we have one more condition, who lived with you for more than half of 2019. Once again, if you were talking 2020, you would think you would replace that for 2020, should be the same. If the child didn't live with you for the required time, see exception to time lived with you later. So that would be the general rule. Again, there could be an exception here. The exception, you can do some more research if that's one of the components that you could take a look at later. If the child meets the conditions to be a qualifying child of any other person, other than your spouse, if filing jointly for 2019 or 2020, if you're talking about this year. C, qualifying child of more than one person. So that's a common situation where there's joint custody situations, and you want to make sure that you're picking up the proper information for that. The general rule is you can't usually report a dependent on two different tax returns. So then there's a question about, what are you going to do in a situation where you have a joint custody type of situation? Next we have, do you have a child who meets the conditions to be your qualifying child? If yes, we're going to go to step 2. If no, we'll go to step 4. So we're going to say yes at this case, and we're going to go to step 2. Is your qualifying child your dependent? So now we're not talking qualifying child, but dependent kind of tests, general dependent tests. Now you would think most of the time, if it's a qualifying child, then they would qualify as a dependent here, right? So now we're talking qualifying child test, dependent test. But let's take a look at it. 1, was the child a U.S. citizen, U.S. national, U.S. resident alien, or resident of Canada or Mexico? If you have questions about that, you can see publication 519. And then if the child was adopted, you can see exception to citizen test later as well. So if yes, then we'll continue on. If no, we have to stop there because you can't claim the child as a dependent. Number 2, was the child married? If yes, then see married later. If no, we're going to continue because once again, we would assume that if married, they wouldn't be claimed as a dependent. General rule, if someone's married, they can't be claimed as a dependent on someone else's return. 3, could you or your spouse, if filing jointly, be claimed as a dependent on someone else's 2019, or if you're doing 2020, you would imagine 2020 being much the same, tax return? See steps 1, 2, and 4. If yes, you can't claim any dependent. Complete the rest of the Form 1040. If no, you can claim this child as a dependent. Complete columns 1 through 3 of the dependent section for the child. So now we've talked about whether or not they're a qualifying child and whether a dependent. Next question here we have, does your qualifying child qualify you for the child tax credit or credit for other dependents? Now, once again, you would think that the first thing you'd want would be the child tax credit. If you don't qualify for that, then the credit for other dependents. So number 1, does the child have a social security number, SSN or ITIN, or an adoption taxpayer identification number, an ATIN, issued on or before the due date of your return, including extensions? So answer yes if you are applying the ITIN or ATIN for the child on or before the due date of the return, including extensions. So if yes, we're going to continue. If no, you can't claim. So we're going to then go to the next one. 2, was the child a U.S. citizen, U.S. national, or U.S. resident alien? If you have a question about that, you can see publication 519 for the definition of them. So if yes, we're going to continue. 3, was the child under age 17 at the end of 2019? So now this is a different age limit here. Notice when we talked about do they qualify for a qualifying child, the age was 19. If they can, and then it was 24 if they're going to be a student. But now we're talking 17 to qualify for the credit. So we got those those 3 different ages here. You're thinking 17, 19, 24 to qualify as a dependent, qualifying child, 19, and then 24 if there's if they're a student, and then 17 is going to be the limit to get the child tax credit here. So if yes, we're going to continue. If no, you can claim the credit for other dependents for this child. Check the credit for other dependents checkbox of the descendant. So that means, if no, it's going to do that. Obviously, the tax software will kind of do this for you because you're going to put the date of birth in there for your dependents, and it'll basically be able to pick that up for you. But when you're talking to, when you're planning or you're talking to someone else, you want to understand that process. You want to be able to verbally say that. So those age limits are important. Then step 4, is your qualifying relative your dependent? So now we're going to qualifying relative, possibly not a child, right? Not a child. we're thinking basically qualifying relative, and we're linking that to the other dependent credit. So a qualified relative is a person who is your son, daughter, stepchild. Now notice, of course, again, if there's son, child, stepchild, or whatnot, then we would be thinking, okay, do they qualify as a qualifying child first? And then if not, they're going to be down here. So one of the components down here, as we'll see shortly, is that they didn't qualify for a qualifying child. That's why we went to step 4 here. So once again, son, daughter, stepchild, foster child, or descendant of any of them. For example, your grandchild or brother, sister, half-brother, half-sister, or son or daughter of any of them. For example, your niece or nephew, or father, mother, or ancestor or sibling of either of them. For example, your grandmother, grandfather, aunt, or uncle, or stepfather, stepsisters, stepbrother, stepsister, stepfather, stepmother, son-in-law, daughter-in-law, father-in-law, mother-in-law, brother-in-law, or sister-in-law, or any other person other than your spouse who lived with you all year as a member of your household if your relationship didn't violate local law. If the person didn't live with you for the required time, you could see the exception to the time lived with you later. So that's going to be a much more broader, obviously, category that could be included here. And again, if you want to see that exception, then if that's a key component, you can drill down to the more information there. Then we have and. This has to be included, another rule to be included, who wasn't a qualifying child. Obviously, the reason we're down here is because they're not a qualifying child. We would want the qualifying child first because that's typically better for tax purposes than down here. So we're going to say not a qualifying child. See step 1 for that, which we did earlier. Of any taxpayer for 2019, of course, it would be similar to 2020, most likely, if you're looking at the 2020 instructions. For this purpose, a person isn't a taxpayer if he or she isn't required to file a U.S. income tax return and either doesn't file such a return or files only to get a refund of withheld income tax or estimated tax pay. You can see publication 501 for details on and examples of that. And next one, who had gross income of less than $4,200 for 2019. Now that's a low threshold. This is the 2019 threshold. It may change slightly for 2020, but you would think you would still have a fairly low income threshold similar to this. Might be adjusted, basically, you would think, for inflation related to it. But again, income threshold, if the person was permanently or totally disabled, see exceptions to gross income test later. And for whom you provided over half of his or her support in 2019. Again, you would think it would be similar for 2020, but see children of divorced or separate parents, multiple support agreement, and kidnapped child later. So if there was a situation where you're concerned about that component, especially in the case where there's a support, where there's multiple support for parents, and they have multiple support, then you can look in and drill down on more detail related to that. So that's where to go for the questionnaire on it. And then again, hopefully in any kind of particular situation, you can go down to more detail on it. We'll then go in a future presentation, take some of these and just look at what the impact will be on the tax return.